Beating terrorism, many countries have made it the core issue in their policies. Yet armed groups continue to kill and maim thousands of people. So is the war on terror failing? And what will it take to win that war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. The topic of terrorism has been at the forefront of world politics for years. Attacks on Western soil dominate the news for weeks after they happen, and the Iraq and Syria wars against ISIL are regularly centre stage on our TV screens. The subject was on the agenda at the recent BRICs conference in China and will be debated at the upcoming UN General Assembly. This week, it's catapulted back into the spotlight for an obvious reason: the 16th anniversary of 9/11. The September 11th attacks in the United States in 2001 have largely defined US foreign policy since and affected lives throughout the world. Almost 3,000 people were killed when hijackers flew planes into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. And the attacks triggered a series of events, including new wars, new immigration policies, and new prejudices. Despite the so-called war on terror, the issue hasn't gone away. Some would argue it's even grown. Al-Qaeda, the group that carried out the 9/11 attacks, is still active in Yemen, parts of Syria, and northern Africa. In the Middle East, in 2014, it morphed into the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. Only recently was it pushed almost entirely out of Iraq. The group is cornered but still active in Syria. In Nigeria, there's Boko Haram, which opposes any Western influence in the country. It's kidnapped schoolgirls in Nigeria and also attacked villages in neighboring countries. And there's been a rise in far-right extremism in Europe and the United States. The recent violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, an example of how white supremacy groups have gained support. 9/11 was the deadliest single attack in US history, but there have been others across the globe which also left a mark. 192 people were killed in the Madrid train bombings in Spain in 2004. Those responsible were believed to have been inspired by Al-Qaeda. 52 people died in the London bombings in July 2005, known as 7/7, a coordinated attack on 3 trains and a bus during morning rush hour in the UK capital. The Mumbai terror attacks in 2008 killed 164 people. 10 Pakistani gunmen rampaged through hotels, restaurants, and other buildings in the Indian city. In 2014, members of the Taliban stormed a school in Peshawar in Pakistan. Of the 141 people who died, most were students. And just last month in Barcelona, a man drove his van through a crowded tourist street known as Las Ramblas, killing 14 and injuring dozens. So how has terrorism changed after 9/11? To tell us more, we're joined by Max Abrams, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Northeastern University in Boston. From Beirut via Skype, Joseph Kachichian, Senior Fellow at the King Faisal Center in Riyadh. Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate with MIT's Security Studies Program. He's also in Boston. A very warm welcome to the show, every one of you. Jim Walsh, how crucial was 9/11 to the security or lack of security we're seeing today?
Well, I think it certainly, for the U.S. government, has fundamentally framed virtually everything going forward. It was one of the most traumatic events in post-war U.S. history. Obviously, it led directly to the invasion of Afghanistan and then later indirectly to the invasion of Iraq. So it's really meant a great deal, both emotionally, but also politically and in terms of foreign policy. It has been the shaping event for U.S. foreign policy.
And Joseph Kachichian, do you think the world would be a different place if 9/11 hadn't happened, or would these issues, these groups come to fruition anyway?
Something else might have occurred in another country, doesn't necessarily have to have been the United States. I think that obviously terrorism has been with us for a long time. The likelihood of it to end anytime soon is infinitesimal. This is the scourge of the 20th century and the 21st century, and we're going to have to learn with it, to learn how to live with it for the rest of our lives. governments have got to really get their act together by trying to end all kinds of support to extremists, something which hopefully we will talk about in a few seconds.
Max Abrams, what would you say the state of the terrorist threat is today? And quite frankly, how safe are we?
Well, I think that it's actually has gotten a little bit better over the past few months. We've made substantial progress against Islamic State. I don't think that that's getting enough attention, particularly in Iraq and in Syria. What we've shown is that the idea of the caliphate is dead. Now, that doesn't mean that the Islamic State threat ceases altogether. You know, there'll be idiots all over the world who will continue to be inspired. However, the recruitment rate overall is down precisely because their political goals have been crushed. And so I do think that we're doing a little bit better than we were a couple months ago, but terrorism is still very much at the forefront of our security concerns.
But hasn't the fight against ISIL and ISIL itself and the members of it morphed into something different? We're seeing these lone wolf attacks in so many different parts of the world. We're seeing a rise of ISIL in the Philippines, for example.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the terrorism threat is evolving. It's metastasizing. What I was saying, though, is that in the aggregate, as a security threat, I'd rather have the organization implode than not implode, even if there is, say, a short-term spike in more sort of decentralized violence. So we do need to, worry about this. But I do think that we made substantial, gains against Islamic State, which will make us safer, not just destroy the caliphate.
Jim, you seem to agree with that.
Yes, I mean, I think Max is absolutely right to say that what's happening to ISIS has not received the attention it deserves, and that they have suffered setbacks. And in particular, with the caliphate looking like that's not going to happen, recruitment is down. I think that's all to the good. And I think Max would also agree that what's going to happen, and we've seen this already from ISIS, is that they're going to evolve into a more traditional, if you will, terror group, where the emphasis won't be on taking and holding territory, which is what it has been, which was their great innovation, as it were, but rather sort of traditional attacks. We saw this in Kobani. When the Kurds kicked ISIL out of Kobani, what did they do? They responded with a truck bomb. And then elsewhere in Iraq and around, once they've lost territory, they've moved to terror acts. So I think Max is absolutely right. The key is hurting these organizations so that they are not capable of carrying out larger mass casualty attacks. But in the near term, I do expect an increase in terrorism, traditional terrorism from ISIS, as they disintegrate.
And Joseph, do you think there might be an increase, as Jim was saying there, because of or despite American foreign policy?
Well, this is a very emotional day, obviously, for Americans, and we feel a great deal for the loss that occurred 16 years ago. But I think that it's a mistake to actually concentrate on terrorism and its Islamic variety. Just a few months ago, in June, if I'm not mistaken, there was this lone doctor in a Bronx hospital that machine gunned several of his colleagues. It is true that we have to deal with ISIL and its ramifications throughout the Muslim world. And the primary targets of these terrorists are, in fact, fellow Muslims who, in their eyes, are not proper Muslims. However, for the United States and other Western powers to deal more effectively with the kind of scourges that they have to deal with, I think it's time, long overdue really, it's time to really reappraise the foreign policy approaches that a lot of these countries have pursued over the years. Let me just give you a simple example of how easy it has been for these European terrorists, French native-born or Belgian native-born or other European native-born terrorists, to go in and out of Turkey as if it was a frequent flyer program going back and forth. All of these governments have a direct responsibility to make sure that the extremists in their societies are handled, and more importantly, that these governments and these societies address the integration problems that has led to these individuals going haywire and committing these atrocious acts of terrorism. So therefore, it's not just a question of one country's foreign policy or vis-a-vis another one. It's a question of a global approach. The time is long overdue for all these governments to end their selective support of extremist groups.
Okay, and Jim, I'm wondering where that puts Saudi Arabia into this discussion, considering, 15 of those involved in the attacks were from Saudi Arabia. Where are they when it comes to dealing with the terrorism threat that we have seen proliferate for years now?
Yeah, when it comes to Saudi Arabia and terrorism, and I think that's the two countries you really want to focus on, frankly, are Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. With the fact that the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, I don't think that's a big deal. Pardon me?
Who work very closely together, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Well, I would say they both have their own sort of individual problems. You referenced the Mumbai attack. That almost led to a war between India and Pakistan Pakistan has long supported any number of extremists. But that's a separate topic. To answer your question about Saudi Arabia, the fact that the attackers were from Saudi Arabia was not a big deal to me. What is a big deal is that Saudi Arabia, for its own reasons, to try to maintain its own legitimacy as a country, has basically allowed extremist ideology in the form of Wahhabism to flourish, and has been an exporter, has been a funder, has been in general, cheerleader for a ideology that has, over time, come to be the root set of beliefs that many who are extremists believe in. So I think I think Saudi Arabia had a pretty bad record. And in Syria, we would have to agree that Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other countries funded anti-Syrian forces. And of course, Assad's a war criminal, don't get me wrong, but funded extremists and used them as proxies. So that continues on. I will say that in some ways, Saudi Arabia is better than it was pre-9/11. It has been a better counterterrorism partner with the United States, more information sharing, more operations. A lot of that had to do with the Crown Prince who was recently replaced, and we'll see where that goes under the new leadership in Saudi Arabia. But I would say in the past, Saudi Arabia was terrible on this issue, and I would say it's gotten better, but we still have to deal with the problem of them supporting individuals in Saudi Arabia supporting a set of religious beliefs that stoke this sort of violence.
Max, if it is true that it is continuing to export terrorism under the guise of Wahhabism, how should Saudi Arabia be dealt with at the moment? I know you're trying to step in there. And what should its relationship be with the US and the UK, for example? We'll get on to Theresa May in a moment.
I mean, I agree with Jim in the sense that there's plenty of blame to go around. What's upsetting beyond just the anniversary of 9/11 is that the direction of the world in terms of our overall collective response to terrorism hasn't been very smart. I think that we're actually contributing to the problems in Afghanistan. We really don't have an answer there. In Iraq, which Jim called it an indirect response. Maybe it was a direct response. Without 9/11, it wouldn't have happened. Removing Saddam Hussein obviously created a power vacuum, helping al-Qaeda to metastasize into al-Qaeda in Iraq and then ISI and then into ISIS. The removal of Gaddafi, I think, contributed to instability in the region, feeding arms and personnel into the Syrian conflict. The support of Islamist militants in order to spearhead regime change has also backfired. I agree with the other guests.
If you support Islamic militants, does it drive them away from the negotiating table? Might they say, what's the point of going to the negotiating table if you keep funding us? Is that a knock-on effect?
Where are we talking about? In general, I'm not in favor of negotiating with, the kinds of actors that I'm talking about.
Okay, Joseph, when it comes to the U.S. foreign policy, I mean, going in and just bombing a country, changing the state of play, affecting the sovereignty, that hasn't helped in the war on terror, has it?
It has not. But before I answer your question, this is really important, and I must really stress this. I mean, we are throwing so many things around. that one has to be very careful about the assessment. Saudi Arabia, the 15 of the 19 alleged hijackers that have died in the process are in fact Saudis. No one is denying that. But Saudi Arabia, during the past couple of years, has arrested over 500 individuals and tried to rehabilitate several thousand others. There is a decision in Saudi Arabia to actually go after these extremists with a vengeance. And the Saudi armed forces and the security personnel have paid a very high price for this. So it's very
So Joseph, do you think this might backfire? Sorry, can I just quickly throw this in here? This report that Saudi Arabia allegedly funded a dry run for the 9/11. I mean, do you think this will undermine what Saudi Arabia is trying to do?
I've seen the report as well today in the New York Post that claims, in fact, that there was a dry run. Of course, this is an allegation. It needs to be proven in a court of law. And presumably, this is part of the JASTA trials that are being prepared right now, with the attorneys putting forward all the evidence that they can. And it's up to the courts to decide whether or not, in fact, there was such dry runs. But I think the more important question that we have to think about is the responsibility that all governments must assume. And to answer specifically your question about the fact that the United States foreign policy has been very selective, obviously, Max said, if I'm not mistaken, earlier on that, in fact, the United States, as a consequence of 9/11, attacked Iraq as well, Afghanistan first and Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, despite all of the lies that we have heard over the year, from weapons of mass destruction to assassination. Nothing to do with 9/11. Absolutely nothing.
Jim?
And that's why I said the word indirectly. In other words, obviously Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with al-Qaeda and Iraq and all of that other business. But what I think President Bush did, however, was take a emotionally fragile United States and took the political opportunity to invade Iraq based on sort of the aftermath of 9/11. So I would say it was indirectly tied, that 9/11 sort of created a political space that allowed President Bush to then go off onto this completely different adventure in Iraq. So they're related, but they're not related in direct substance.
Going into Iraq after 9/11 was a horrendous move, and we're still dealing with those repercussions. What I was saying, though, is that in the absence of 9/11, we wouldn't have gone into Iraq. There's a very good article by a scholar named Chaim Kaufman, which shows the bump in U.S. support for going into Iraq pre and post 9/11. And so in that sense, 9/11 had a direct effect, but it was very unfortunate because, of course, Iraq was not responsible for those terrorist attacks.
Okay, so here we are today. Whatever impact 9/11 has had, you all agree that governments need to do their bit to put a stop to this rise in terrorism that we're seeing. How do governments do their bit, Joseph? I mean, should there be greater attention to the grassroots level problems that we are seeing in a lot of these countries?
Governments can do a great deal. They are largely responsible for the rise of extremism. This does not grow on trees, essentially. Policies lead individuals, whom I will not call crazies, individuals who actually take extremist measures in order to rectify wrongs the way they perceive it. And in fragile societies throughout the world, not just the Muslim world, but throughout the world, we are seeing that governments are abdicating their responsibilities to come to terms with the fundamental changes in these societies. You have injustices, you have poverty, you have lack of resources, you have lack of education. All of these issues together must be taken into account as the governments must come to the table and share the kind of information that they have. And in those instances where there are extremists who commit acts of violence, no doubt about the fact that they should be tried in a court of law and punished accordingly.
Jim, what about the knock-on effect, again, of this war on terror? We're seeing a dramatic increase in refugees. This has angered many, particularly in the far right, of the countries that have been most affected. How do you deal with those troublemakers in the far right? Charlottesville, for example.
Well, first of all, I would say let's be careful about our categories. I am, opposed to white supremacists and the violence that they've committed. But we want to distinguish between, I think, as we step back and we sort of look at where things are, we've had some successes, and the successes have been in stopping mass casualty attacks. We have not had another 9/11, and we have better coordination and better information collection, and law enforcement and counterterrorism organizations do a better job than they did before 9/11.
Maybe not in the US. We've seen them in other parts in Europe, particularly.
Yes. Well, I was going to say there's another half to this story, and that is that, when individuals act out, lone wolves inspired by racial hatred or, religious extremism or for whatever reason, that's very hard for law enforcement to deal with. And it doesn't mean we're losing just because individuals strike out on their own. But I do want to point out that as we weigh whether we've been successful or whether we've failed, we also have to talk about the new costs. Our actions have been costly, and we have to put that on the ledger as well. So the U.S. has set up a gigantic and very expensive, but I would underline gigantic, secret information collection system, and has engaged in domestic surveillance. And we have authoritarians in other countries who will accuse their opposition of label them as simply being terrorists. Now, anyone who opposes a government is called a terrorist, whether they're violent or not. And so I think this effort, and I never liked the phrase war on terrorism, I think that's a real misnomer, but this effort to counter extremism has been successful in stopping big attacks, has been successful after major organizations, Al-Qaeda Central and now ISIL, has been less good, and understandably so, because it's just a tough nut to crack at dealing with sort of lower level attacks that are awful nevertheless, but they're not the same thing as 9/11. But in doing this, we've also paid a very high price. And also, we have to recognize that, as we've seen in Syria, the governments, and Joseph alludes to this, continue to use their favorite extremists as proxies for their own foreign policy goals. So, whether that's Pakistan using extremists in Kashmir, or the U.S. and Saudi Arabia using extremists in Syria to fight the Assad government. So we've made improvements. We've paid a big cost, but some of these practices continue. There are still governments that support terrorists.
It seems that the war on terrorism or terror, or whatever you want to call it, on these groups needs to be looked at again. And I'm just wondering, Jim, Max, with the United Nations General Assembly coming up, looming, Donald Trump is going to make his first speech there. If we are likely to see any change with these America First, are we likely to see diplomacy taking a role of a military option, possibly?
I mean, I agree with the gist of the other guests, and that is that the world really is not coalescing together to focus on the terrorism threat. It still seems as if there are good terrorists and bad terrorists, depending on the geopolitical aims of the group and which proxies can be used. And this is very unfortunate behavior. In terms of what I expect the future of terrorism to look like, if you will, I think we're going to see more of the same. I think we're going to see a continuation of a decentralization of the terrorism threat. I think that there's less tolerance for groups to build up strongholds. I think that Idlib is going to get attacked soon. I think, well, hopefully, but I also expect HTS to get broken up. With the rise in communications and growing globalization and social media platforms, I think that the lone wolf problem is here to stay. And I think that that we really don't have an answer, and it will change the nature of the kind of terrorism that we're facing. Not so much the mass casualty attacks, but still pretty big ones, like the one in Orlando, for example.
Many factors to this topic, but sadly we're going to have to leave it there. Max Abrams, Joseph Kachichian, and Jim Walsh, thank you very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine is @Jane Dutton. Thank you for watching.